welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going deep on a topic that hits close to home for all of us, I think.
It really does.
It's the biology of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
We all have those moments where we do something and we think, why did I do that?
Oh, yeah.
What makes people tick?
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to dive deep today and explore, those intricate workings of our brains and how they shape, everything we do, from how we feel to how we act.
It's going to be a really fun journey, and we've got a great guide.
Yes.
Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave.
Yes.
Get ready to have your assumptions challenged and your understanding of just human nature in general really expanded.
What really struck me was just how Sapolsky approaches this whole topic.
Yeah.
It's not like he's just looking at one slice of biology, like just brain chemistry or genetics or whatever.
Right.
He is weaving together all these insights from neurobiology and endocrinology and psychology, even anthropology.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, look, if we really want to understand ourselves, we need to look at the big picture.
Absolutely. And he really argues that all of these disciplines are really just completely linked.
Yeah.
And that trying to explain behavior through just one of those lenses is like trying to understand a symphony by just listening to one instrument.
Okay. I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So how does that actually play out?
Right.
Like when we're talking about something like aggression.
Okay, so let's say we have this scenario where someone's reacting aggressively.
Okay.
Sapolsky would say, don't jump to conclusions.
Yeah.
Don't just say, oh, it's their personality or how they were brought up or whatever.
Right.
Instead, what he does is he traces that behavior back through all these layers of influence.
Oh, so like peeling back an onion, but way more fascinating.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So we start by looking at, what's happening right now in their environment.
Okay.
Is there something threatening them?
Huh.
Are they feeling stressed? Are they overwhelmed?
Okay.
Then we can zoom in even further.
Okay.
Look at the hormones, the neurotransmitters, is there a surge of testosterone amping up their response?
Mm-hmm.
Is there prefrontal cortex, the part that helps regulate impulses? Is that already tired out from, a really demanding day?
Yeah.
And then we can go even further back than that. Look at their developmental history,
Okay.
Did they experience trauma that could be making them more sensitive to certain threats?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of social and cultural norms did they grow up with?
Okay.
And we might even consider their genetics, realizing that genes aren't destiny,
Right.
but they can influence things like temperament and emotional reactivity.
So it's like this cascade of influences.
It really is.
From what's happening right now to like our evolutionary history.
Yeah.
And that's all shaping, just a single moment of behavior.
It's so complex.
Yeah.
It really shows you that simple explanations just don't work.
Wow. Okay, so we have this multi-layered model now, I guess.
Right.
Let's dive into some specific examples.
Okay.
Sapolsky spends quite a bit of time talking about the amygdala. Isn't that the part of the brain that's associated with fear and aggression?
It is, but it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
So the amygdala plays a really important role in processing sensory information.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to, detecting threats.
Okay.
But here's the thing. It actually gets that input from our senses before the cortex does.
Oh.
The cortex is responsible for, more detailed conscious processing.
Okay, so it's like the amygdala is jumping into action before the rest of the brain has fully, assessed the situation.
Exactly. It's like the first responder. It's primed to alert us to danger.
Okay.
But the problem is that quick and dirty processing, sometimes it can lead to false alarms.
Oh, like that time I thought I saw a snake in my backyard and it turned out to be a garden hose.
Yes, exactly.
My amygdala was like, danger, danger. And then my brain finally caught up and was like, oh, wait, nope, that's not a threat.
Exactly. And Sapolsky uses a similar scenario, mistaking a cell phone for a handgun in a dark room.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The amygdala is operating on a better safe than sorry principle.
Right.
So it might trigger that fear response before your visual cortex has even had time to figure out what it's actually looking at.
That's both fascinating and a little bit terrifying.
It is.
It really highlights how much, our biology is shaping our perceptions and our reactions in ways we aren't even aware of.
Absolutely.
And speaking of things that are both fascinating and potentially terrifying, Sapolsky also talks about the amygdala's role in pain perception.
Right. And he says that the amygdala is more sensitive to unpredictable pain than predictable pain.
Okay.
So think about the difference between knowing you're about to get a shot and then just randomly getting pricked by a pin.
Okay.
They both involve pain, but that unpredictability of the pinprick is way more stressful.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of not knowing that really ramps up the anxiety.
Exactly. And that links back to our modern lives in really interesting ways.
Okay.
How much are we just bombarded with unpredictable events and news and everything?
Constantly, yeah.
It's like our amygdales are on constant high alert.
Yeah.
Just trying to figure out what's going on in a world that feels increasingly chaotic.
Right. So if our amygdala is like this vigilant guard dog, always looking out for danger, what about the part of our brain that's supposed to keep everything in check?
Right.
The rational decision maker.
That would be the frontal cortex.
Okay.
It's often called the executive center of the brain.
Okay.
It's responsible for planning and impulse control and complex decision-making. But here's the thing. It's not some kind of superhuman control panel that's always in charge.
Wait, are you saying our rational minds aren't as rational as we think?
Well, the frontal cortex is an amazing piece of machinery,
Yeah.
but it does have limitations.
Okay.
And one of the key concepts that Sapolsky highlights is this thing called cognitive load.
Okay.
So when we're dealing with demanding tasks, like trying to focus on a complex problem or regulate our emotions when we're stressed,
Right.
our frontal cortex is working really hard. And just like any other part of our body, it can get tired.
So you're saying willpower is a finite resource.
Yes.
Like if we spend all day making tough decisions, we're going to have less mental energy to resist that extra slice of cake at night.
That's the idea.
Okay.
When we overload our frontal cortex, it can impair our performance on other tasks.
Okay,
So
yeah.
that feeling of mental fatigue after a long day isn't just in our heads, it's a real biological phenomenon.
So like those times when I snap at somebody after a really stressful day, maybe it's not just me being a jerk.
Right.
Maybe my frontal cortex is just saying, I'm done, I need a break.
That's certainly possible, and there's research to back this up.
Really?
Yeah, there's this one study they used this technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation to temporarily silence a part of the frontal cortex.
Wow.
This part's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC.
Okay.
And they found that when that region was offline, people were more likely to accept unfair offers in an economic game.
So they were basically throwing fairness out the window when their DLPFC was on mute.
It seems that way, and what's even more interesting is that this only happened when people thought they were playing against another person.
Oh.
When they thought they were playing against a computer, it didn't have any impact.
Wow. So context matters.
Context matters a lot.
Yeah.
Our brains are always evaluating the social situation and adjusting our behavior.
So fascinating.
And this brings us to another character in the story of our brains.
Okay.
Dopamine.
Oh, dopamine, the pleasure molecule, the key to happiness, the fuel of desire.
Well, hold on a second.
Okay.
Dopamine's role is more nuanced than that.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's not just about pleasure, it's more about the anticipation of reward.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, well, think about that classic experiment with monkeys and lever pressing.
Okay.
Researchers found that dopamine was released in the monkeys' brains, not when they actually got the reward,
Okay.
but when they saw the signal that the reward was coming.
Oh, so it's that feeling of like excitement and anticipation,
Exactly.
like when you're about to go on vacation or see your favorite band.
Yeah,
Okay.
dopamine is about the thrill of the chase.
The expectation.
Yes, the expectation of something good.
Oh, wow.
And this has some really interesting implications for how we understand motivation and behavior.
Yeah, I bet. So it's like the anticipation is almost better than the actual reward.
It really is, and it just shows how powerful that dopamine reward system is.
Yeah.
It's what keeps us going, keeps us exploring, trying new things.
So speaking of powerful systems, let's talk about hormones.
Okay.
Now, we all have these ideas about how hormones shape our behavior.
Right.
Testosterone, for example, often seen as the aggression hormone.
Yeah.
Is that really true, though?
Well, it's not that simple.
Okay.
Testosterone doesn't directly cause aggression.
Right.
Think of it more as an amplifier.
Okay.
It can make those tendencies that are already there for aggressive behavior stronger, especially when there's a social trigger.
So it's not like testosterone flips a switch and suddenly turns someone into a raging beast.
It's all about the context.
Okay.
And Sapolsky talks about this research showing that testosterone makes the amygdala more responsive to angry faces,
Okay.
but not to happy faces or neutral faces.
Oh, interesting.
So if someone's already kind of prone to aggression, testosterone might ramp up that reaction.
Okay.
But if they're not normally an aggressive person,
Right.
testosterone alone isn't going to suddenly change them.
So it's more like a volume knob than an on-off switch.
Exactly.
Okay. And context is so important. What about oxytocin?
Okay.
That's the love hormone, right?
Oxytocin definitely plays a role in social bonding,
Okay.
especially between romantic partners and parents and children.
Yeah.
But it's not always just oxytocin equals love.
I was going to say there's a bit coming.
There is.
Okay.
Research has actually shown that oxytocin can also promote in-group favoritism.
Wow.
And it can actually increase aggression towards people outside of that group.
Wait, really? So the hormone that helps us bond with loved ones can also make us hostile to those we see as different?
It sounds kind of contradictory,
Yeah.
but it makes sense when you look at it from an evolutionary perspective. Oxytocin probably evolved to strengthen bonds within groups, which would have been really important for survival back then.
Right.
But sometimes that means that those in-group ties get stronger at the expense of hostility towards other groups.
So love thy neighbor, but be wary of strangers.
Right.
That's a little unsettling.
It is a little bit.
Are there any studies that really demonstrate this, darker side of oxytocin?
Sapolsky mentions one where people played an economic game in teams.
Okay.
When they were given oxytocin, they were more generous to their teammates.
Okay, that makes sense.
But when they were playing against members of the other team,
Yeah.
the oxytocin actually made them more likely to attack the other team first.
Wow. So even something like a hormone,
Yeah.
the context can really change how it affects us.
It really can.
It makes you wonder how oxytocin might be playing into, all these social dynamics, good and bad.
Absolutely. It really adds a whole other layer of complexity
Yeah, for sure.
to understanding how our biology influences how we interact with each other.
Speaking of complexity, let's talk about stress.
Okay.
We all experience it,
Right.
but sometimes I think we forget that stress is more than just a feeling.
Oh, yeah.
It has real effects on our bodies and our brains.
It really does. The stress response is this ancient biological mechanism. It's meant to help us deal with threats.
Okay.
So imagine a zebra running away from a lion.
Okay.
And then the zebra's stress response kicks in. It releases these hormones like adrenaline and cortisol.
Right.
And those get its body ready to either fight or run away.
So it's like our body's hitting the emergency button.
Exactly. And in those short bursts, that stress response is super helpful.
Right.
It helps us survive dangerous situations.
Right, of course.
But here's the problem. In today's world, we're dealing with this constant low-grade stress that keeps our stress response kind of simmering in the background.
It's like having a demanding job, traffic jams, financial worries,
Exactly.
the constant news cycle.
It's just always there.
Yeah.
And when we're stressed all the time, our bodies are basically stuck in that fight or flight mode.
So that feeling of being like wired and on edge all the time,
Yeah,
that's our bodies being flooded with stress hormones.
exactly. It's no wonder it's so exhausting.
It's really tiring.
Yeah, and here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
When we're stressed out all the time,
Yeah.
it can actually make it harder to make good decisions.
Okay. I've definitely noticed that I'm not exactly my most rational self when I'm stressed out.
And that makes sense biologically.
Okay.
Sapolsky mentions research showing that when we're under constant stress, it impairs what's called risk assessment.
Okay.
So we might act too recklessly, or we might be too afraid to take any risks at all.
So it's like our brain is just saying, make a decision, any decision.
Yeah.
Just get me out of this stressful situation.
That's a good way to put it.
I'm going to remember that next time I have to make a big decision when I'm stressed out,
Yeah.
I'll try to take a step back, maybe do some deep breathing or some meditation.
Those are great strategies.
Yeah.
And they really show another amazing feature of our brains.
What's that?
Plasticity.
Brain plasticity. The idea that our brains are always changing and adapting to what we experience.
Exactly.
I love that concept.
It's so cool. Our brains aren't just these fixed things. They're dynamic.
Yeah.
They respond to the world around us. And that means our experiences, both the good and the bad, they can actually shape how our brains are structured and how they function throughout our lives.
So it's not just our minds that are learning and growing. Our brains are physically changing too.
Exactly. And Sapolsky gives this great example.
Okay.
Musicians who play string instruments, they often have larger representations of their fingers in the sensory cortex.
Okay.
That's the part of the brain that processes touch. The more they play, the more brain space is dedicated to processing those sensations.
That is so cool.
It is.
It makes you think about how all our different skills and hobbies, are reflected in our brains.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
But you mentioned plasticity isn't always about good changes, right?
Unfortunately, no.
No.
Trauma can also cause big and lasting changes in the brain,
Okay.
especially in those regions that deal with fear and anxiety and memory.
Right.
And that can contribute to things like PTSD, where
Right.
people keep experiencing the effects of the trauma long after it's over.
It's a reminder that both the positive and the negative experiences we have,
Yeah.
they can really shape who we are.
They really can.
So this leads us to a stage of life where brain plasticity is really pronounced.
Okay.
Adolescence,
Oh, yeah.
the teenage years.
The teenage years.
All those hormones, the risk-taking, the emotional roller coaster.
Right.
What makes those years so turbulent?
Well, the adolescent brain is still under construction.
Okay.
You know, those parts of the brain that are in charge of things like planning and impulse control and regulating emotions, especially the prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
they're still developing.
So their hormones are revving up while the brakes are still being installed.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And there's another thing, too.
What's that?
Adolescents are actually more sensitive to rewards than adults are.
Really?
Yeah, their brains release more dopamine when they experience something pleasurable.
So they're wired for excitement and trying new things.
In a way, yes, but
Oh.
that sensitivity to rewards, combined with the fact that their prefrontal cortex is still developing,
Yeah.
it can lead to risky behavior.
It's like they're driving a really powerful car, but they haven't quite mastered the controls yet.
Exactly, and it's important to remember this isn't like a flaw in how they're wired.
Right.
You know, this time of risk-taking and exploration was probably really important in our evolutionary past.
Huh?
It helped teenagers learn about the world and find their place in it.
So maybe we should rethink how we view adolescence.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to shut down those urges,
Right.
maybe we should focus on giving them safe and healthy ways to explore those urges.
That's a great point, and it really highlights how important it is to understand this biological stuff.
Yeah.
It's not about making excuses for bad choices.
Right.
It's about recognizing those developmental forces at play
Yeah.
and creating environments that help them grow in healthy ways.
Speaking of environments,
Yeah.
it's time we talk about culture.
Okay.
Can how we're raised actually shape our brains?
It really can.
Wow.
There's this new field called cultural neuroscience,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about how our cultural values and practices can
Yeah.
have a huge impact on how our brains develop and function.
So it's not nature versus nurture.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
more like they're working together.
It's an intricate dance.
Yes.
For example, let's look at collectivist and individualist cultures.
Okay.
So collectivist cultures, they really value social harmony and interdependence,
Mhm.
while individualist cultures put more emphasis on personal freedom and achievement.
Right.
Research has shown that these cultural values actually show up in differences in brain activity.
Really? So how does that work?
Well, studies have found that people from collectivist cultures, they show more activity in brain areas that are linked to social cognition and empathy
Okay.
when they're thinking about how their actions might affect other people.
Interesting.
But people from individuals' cultures,
Yeah.
they tend to show more activity in areas related to self-reflection and personal goals.
Wow. So what we value is literally shaping how our brains process information.
It's amazing, isn't it? And it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
There's actually evidence that cultural differences can influence genetic variation within populations.
Wait, are you saying that culture can affect our genes?
It's not that culture directly changes our DNA sequence, but remember those epigenetic changes we talked about?
Yeah. The ones that can switch genes on or off.
Exactly. Well, it seems like our cultural experiences can affect those modifications.
Wow.
And that can lead to lasting changes in how our genes are expressed.
So the culture we live in isn't just shaping our thoughts and behaviors.
Right.
It's also influencing how our genes are expressed.
It's like this incredible feedback loop between culture and biology.
Wow.
It really highlights how our genes and our environments are constantly interacting.
Yeah.
And this brings us to this really fundamental question about human behavior.
Okay. What's that?
How do we make moral decisions?
Morality, that age-old debate between our heads and our hearts.
Right, between reason and intuition.
Yeah. How does biology play into all of this?
Well, it turns out that moral decision-making is this complex interplay
Okay.
between reason and intuition.
Mhm.
We like to think we're rational,
Yeah.
but our moral judgments are really influenced by emotions,
Okay.
especially empathy and disgust.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you see someone being treated unfairly,
Mm-hmm.
you feel this instant outrage
Yeah.
and you want to help them. That reaction isn't based on some cold calculation of right and wrong.
Exactly. And there's this famous thought experiment called the trolley problem
Okay.
that really highlights this tension.
Okay, tell me about it.
So imagine there's this runaway trolley, and it's heading straight for 5 people who are tied to the tracks.
Yeah.
And you can pull a lever to switch the trolley onto a side track.
Okay.
But there's 1 person tied to that track.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one.
It is.
So what do you do?
Logically, saving 5 lives seems like the obvious choice.
Right.
But the idea of causing someone's death, even if it saves more lives, just feels wrong.
And this dilemma shows us 2 different ethical frameworks.
Okay.
Utilitarianism and deontology.
Okay.
So utilitarians would say you should pull the lever.
Right, because it saves more lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But deontologists might say that intentionally harming someone is always wrong no matter what. So it's like there's a moral tug-of-war happening in our brains.
Exactly. And brain imaging studies have actually shown
Wow.
that different parts of our brains are active when we make those different kinds of moral judgments. Utilitarian judgments, they tend to involve areas linked to logic and planning.
Okay.
But deontological judgments show more activity in areas related to emotions and empathy.
So our moral philosophies are reflected in how our brains work.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
What about those times when we make these snap judgments
Yeah.
about right and wrong?
Mhm.
Like when you instinctively help someone who's fallen,
Right.
or you pull back from something that feels morally disgusting.
That's moral intuition.
Okay.
And research suggests that those gut feelings are often driven by really fast processing
Okay.
in brain regions like the amygdala, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the insula.
Wow. So our gut feelings about right and wrong can be just as strong as our reasoned ethical beliefs.
Absolutely. And sometimes they even clash. Yeah. And that's when we have those moral conflicts, where we're torn between what we think we should do and what we feel we should do.
It's like our brains are having a moral debate.
Exactly. We've covered so much today.
I know.
From the amygdala's role in threat detection
Yeah.
to how culture can even influence our genes.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey.
It really has.
Even with this quick look, it's so clear that understanding the biology of behavior, it can give us these incredible insights
You can.
into who we are and why we do the things we do.
Absolutely. It challenges us to look beyond those simple explanations and embrace how complex human nature really is.
So what stands out to you as one of the most important takeaways?
I think the biggest thing for me is remembering that we can't understand behavior in isolation.
Okay.
It doesn't matter if we're talking about a neurochemical being released or a hormone surging through our bloodstream or a cultural value shaping our worldview. Context is everything.
It's like that saying, it's not the notes you play, it's how you play them. The same building blocks can lead to such different outcomes.
Yeah.
Depending on the person, the environment, and all those different factors at play.
Absolutely. And that has huge implications for how we approach things like personal responsibility and social justice.
Okay.
We can't just label someone as aggressive or altruistic based on a single thing they do.
Right.
We have to consider all the things that have shaped that behavior.
It's a call for empathy and understanding.
It is.
Recognizing that we're all products of our biology, our
Yeah.
experiences, and the cultures we live in.
And this understanding can be really powerful.
Right.
If we can understand what contributes to both the best and the worst in us, we can start to create environments that bring out the best in everyone.
So we can foster cooperation, promote understanding, maybe even move towards a more peaceful and compassionate world.
That would be amazing.
It would. Yeah, it really makes you think about things in a new way, doesn't it?
It really does. And Sapolsky doesn't shy away from the hard stuff.
Oh, yeah.
He actually spends a lot of time in Behave talking about things like war and tribalism and even xenophobia.
Okay, wow. So we're getting into some serious territory here.
Yeah.
Does he offer any hope for humanity? Or are we just doomed to keep repeating these cycles of conflict and violence?
That's the big question. And Sapolsky doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He digs into the research on, the evolutionary roots of aggression and the things in our brains that make us favor our own group and be hostile to others.
Right.
But he also emphasizes that our brains are capable of incredible things.
Like what?
Kindness, compassion, altruism.
So it's not just a case of our biology determining our fate.
No.
We have the potential to choose a different path.
That's what Sapolsky suggests.
Okay.
He says understanding our biology isn't about excusing bad behavior.
Right.
It's about giving us the power to make more conscious choices.
So if we can understand what leads to conflict and violence,
Yeah.
then we can start to create systems that encourage peace and cooperation.
Exactly. He wants us to move past these simple ideas of good and evil and embrace a more nuanced view of what it means to be human.
That sounds pretty challenging in a world that feels so divided.
It is.
So where do we even start?
He says start with yourself.
Okay.
Become more self-aware, practice empathy, challenge your own biases.
Uh-huh.
We can start breaking down those us versus them barriers that cause so much conflict.
It's funny.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how oxytocin, the so-called love hormone,
Right.
can actually fuel that in-group bias and aggression.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that even when we have good intentions, our biology can sometimes hijack them.
It's a call to be more aware,
Yeah.
to really examine our motivations.
It sounds like Sapolsky is calling for a revolution, not just in science, but in how we think about ourselves and our place in the world.
I think you're right.
Wow.
And he reminds us that that revolution starts with each of us.
So by understanding the biology of behavior,
Yep.
we can become more conscious in our lives
Absolutely.
and help create a more just and compassionate world.
That's the goal.
Well, I'm feeling really inspired.
Yeah.
And also kind of overwhelmed.
There's a lot to take in.
It is. It's like we've been given this peek behind the curtain of what makes us human.
Right.
And now it's up to us to use that knowledge wisely.
I agree. I think one of the most powerful things we can take away from Behave
What's that?
is that we're not just puppets of our genes or our environment.
Right.
We can shape our own lives, learn from our mistakes, and work towards a better future.
That's a really hopeful thought.
It is.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the biology of behavior.
I hope everyone enjoyed it.
To all our listeners out there, remember, you're not just a bunch of neurons and hormones.
You're so much more than that.
You're this amazing, complex, ever-changing being.
You have the power to understand yourself, to challenge your own beliefs, and to choose a path that feels right for you.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing the wonder of this incredible thing we call life.
That's what it's all about.
See you next time.